With the recent release of Avengers Endgame, a storyline that weaved through 22 movies over the course of over a decade has finally come to an end, and in celebration, I thought I'd do a little something different this month. Because you know, when I'm discussing the films with people, something that nobody ever asks me is, "Hey Patrick, how would you reimagine the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe using entirely Golden Age characters?" I have ideas. Minor spoilers for pretty much everything. The man with the super brain. He solves all plots against the government, but the plotters cannot solve his plot against them. I think you can strip the armor off of Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark and still have one of the most compelling characters in the history of cinematic superheroes. He reminds me, in fact, of MLJ's The Wizard. Blaine Whitney comes from a long line of highly accomplished men with considerable wealth backing him. Like Tony Stark, Whitney uses his high intelligence to create fantastic gadgets in many fields of expertise. In the comics, he's said to have a super brain, which allows not only vast intelligence, but clairvoyance, telepathy, hypnosis, and even superhuman strength gained by the sheer force of will he's able to muster. But for the purposes of my hypothetical alternate cinematic universe, I'll give him reasoning ability that simulates clairvoyance and telepathy as he reasons things out, even what's going on far away or what someone else is thinking, with phenomenal accuracy. I'd leave out the hypnosis altogether, and I would attribute his super strength to technology, but I'm keeping him in the tuxedo and cape because tell me RD Jr. wouldn't rock that. The Wizard is known for a succession of amazing high-tech vehicles, and I would completely use that to its best advantage. The special effects budget would go heavily towards flying cars, transforming submarines, jets that become mechs, and motorcycles that climb sheer surfaces. Despite using Golden Age characters, my alternate CU would be set in the present day, and I take full advantage of the modern city landscape. Blaine Whitney's romantic interest from the comics, Jane Barlow, is fairly by the numbers, so I'd replace her with the bodyguard/security head I'll name Josephine Higgins, a name with significance I'll get to later if you're not up on your MLJ trivia. This would be a somewhat more action-oriented role for Gwyneth Paltrow, setting up events for later down the hypothetical franchise. In terms of story, I'd combine the Wizard's origin from Top Notch Comics #1, a fairly basic origin, with elements of the original Iron Man movie. The whole demonstration of technology, capture by the terrorists, and subsequent escape by designing his signature weaponry on the sly, I'd leave intact. But from there, the story steers into a different direction, namely the plot of the first appearance of Quality Comics character Bozo the Iron Man. Except, I'd just call him the Iron Man with one quip of Blaine calling him, "Hey, ya bozo," so that 6 people in the audience who are familiar with the character can applaud. Bozo the Iron Man was a giant robot of tremendous destructive capability created by evil scientist Dr. Von Thorpe, played here by Jeff Bridges. The goal in the comics was general mayhem, but here it's a very deliberate move to discredit Blaine Whitney by using his own tech to devastate a major population center. In the comics, the Iron Man was defeated and subsequently programmed as a force for good by private detective Hugh Hazard, but of course here the Wizard will do the honors of destroying it, although I'll bring Hazard in as an FBI agent investigating Whitney's perceived involvement with the giant menace. Hazard played, of course, by Clark Gregg. We'll also keep Jon Favreau in as a character very similar to Happy Hogan, but we'll go ahead and name him Roy Carter after the comic wizard's sidekick Roy the Superboy. Born out of death, a hideous monster stalks the earth, wreaking havoc on the human race in revenge against his creator, Frankenstein. Yes, I know Mark Ruffalo wasn't in the first Hulk movie, but he's in my imaginary movie, damn it! Price Comics' Frankenstein is about a monster created by Dr. Victor Frankenstein, although this telling is set in the modern day. Price Comics' version of the monster is called Frankenstein throughout his run, so don't yell at me for calling him Frankenstein. That's actually his name in this iteration. Although this is replacing the Incredible Hulk in my hypothetical timeline, that movie won't resemble this one very much, as I'm going to start off with the origin of Frankenstein. This is not where I'm casting Ruffalo, by the way. Dr. Victor Frankenstein would be played by Vin Diesel, and the monster is CGI, voiced and motion captured by Diesel. Ruffalo will instead be playing Bulldog Denny. In the comics, Denny Dunson is a relative of Frankenstein who takes it upon himself to chase down the monster, being the primary protagonist of the comic series. But here, I'd make him a lab assistant of Dr. Frankenstein who partially blames himself for the destruction the monster is bringing. This version of Denny would have the same awkward charm Ruffalo brings to Bruce Banner, and his lack of physical prowess would be made up for by intelligence and determination. The comic Frankenstein is an utterly irredeemable horror. His first act is shoving small children through the bars of a lion's cage, for crying out loud. But the movie version would be a monster with a sliver of conscience, much like the Hulk himself, driven by rage but capable of seeing through it. The plot would involve the monster's rampage and Denny's attempts to thwart it, and by the end of the film, Bulldog Denny is able to serve as a conscience to the beast, being Banner to Frankenstein's Hulk, but in separate bodies. In the second installment of The Wizard, our titular hero is joined by Scarlett Johansson as STARR FLAGG, Undercover Girl, an espionage agent from various titles by Magazine Enterprise, and a character I'm really surprised I haven't talked about more on this channel. This would be the first story that directly ties to the overarching through story of my alternate cinematic universe, as the Wizard and Undercover Girl meet to unravel the threads of a subversive organization who has been sabotaging important research around the globe. They track down the villain in the form of the Skull, a villain I'm borrowing from fellow MLJ hero the Black Hood, and played by Mickey Rourke. During the course of all this, chemist John Dickering, played by Don Cheadle, is poisoned by experimental chemicals in the Skull's attempt to kill him, and instead becomes the Comet, able to fly and fire destructive energy from his eyes. A bit of a more hard-edged character than War Machine in the Iron Man films, the Comet has a volatile temper, requiring the Wizard to rein in Dickering's destructive impulses. Even though the Skull is defeated at the end of the film, evidence shows there was, in fact, someone pulling this master villain's strings. Grant Farrell, an ordinary mortal, is suddenly invested with the supernatural powers of the ancient god Thor, son of Odin, supreme ruler of Valhalla. Yeah, Hemsworth is still Thor, and in this version, so is Anthony Hopkins. Hopkins plays the ancient god Thor, sensing something amiss on Earth, but as he is now the ruler of Asgard, he cannot himself investigate matters. Instead, he selects a mortal of moral fortitude, Grant Farrell, to bestow his powers upon. This is the Fox Comics version of Thor, but his power set is largely the same as Marvel's. Flight, lightning, a hammer that always returns to his hands. In this incarnation, though, he's a mortal with godly power, and Hemsworth would be called upon to play him with a bit more vulnerability and less self-assuredness than the Marvel Universe character. Natalie Portman is on board as his girlfriend Glinda, although the plot here would be very different from the first Thor movie. The story would revolve around an extra-dimensional conqueror called the Black Death, played by Tom Hiddleston. Played with the intensity of Hiddleston's Loki in the original Thor and Avengers movies, but without the sympathetic turn from later installments, as he brings hordes of minions to Earth in a bid for conquest. The sympathetic path is instead taken by the Sorceress of Zoom, played by Jamie Alexander. The Sorceress appears at first to be the leader of the conquering army until the Black Death betrays her and she joins forces with Thor to halt the progress of his armies. The comic Sorceress of Zoom was immensely powerful with seemingly endless magical powers, but we'll limit them here by necessity. She's still a force to be reckoned with, but even she shakes in fear by the mastermind who is truly behind the invasion. Yeah, we're not changing this much. I mean, no reason not to keep Captain America around when we're playing in the Golden Age sandbox. This story can run mostly as is. The Golden Age Bucky was right 10 years old, but it fully makes sense to age him up and keep Sebastian Stan in the role. Peggy Carter, although her adventures were set in World War II, however, was created in the 1960s and therefore not a Golden Age character, so I changed the name of Haley Atwell's character to Betty Ross, Cap's actual Golden Age romantic interest. I would otherwise keep the character as written. Swap out the Howling Commandos for any number of military heroes, and we'll call this one a wrap. Even leave Hugo Weaving in as the Red Skull, or, replace him with Ross Marquand, either way. Now, I would want the first Avengers movie in my hypothetical cinematic universe to follow the basics of the Avengers origin story from the comic, at least at first. Prize Comics number 24 featured a story that involved Bulldog Denny gathering up several superheroes to help him combat Frankenstein, and I'd use that as the basis for Act 1 of this epic. Much as the Hulk was in Avengers number 1, the comic, Frankenstein here is being manipulated, in this case by the Black Death, to cause destruction in a plan to draw Thor's attention. However, the trap set for Thor ends up drawing in the Wizard, Captain America, and Undercover Girl as well. But this is a Golden Age story, and Golden Age super teams always have to split up and take different parts of a mission on individually before they can meet up for the big climactic finale. So after Act 1's initial conflict is resolved, we discover the Black Death's plan is to rip the Earth literally apart with devices set at crucial fault lines around the world. At each location, our heroes are forced to deal with minion hordes and the gathering of villains one expects to find from a gathering of heroes like this. The Wizard and the Comet travel to Burma, where they are confronted by the Red Skull. Captain America is joined by Gwyneth Paltrow's Josephine Higgins, now wearing a suit of powered armor manufactured by the Wizard and calling herself the Shield. The patriotic pair battle the Skull in Cameroon. Meanwhile, Frankenstein and Bulldog Denny take on Iron Man in Chile, and Undercover Girl is joined by Kobe Smulders as the Sword in New Zealand, battling monstrous serpentine villain the Cobra. The Sword is a character from Ace Comics who found the Sword of Excalibur, and I'm doing a gender-swapped version here because, while Cobra is the villain of Ace Comics Magno and Davy, played here by Alexis Denisof. While all this is going on, Thor and the Sorceress of Zoom confront the Black Death himself in California, and the earthquake there is actually set off. Massive special effects porn as San Francisco is ripped apart, and the heroes join forces to deal with the destruction. This movie would also see the introduction of government agency X5 and its leader Captain Battle, played by Samuel L. Jackson. The comic Captain Battle is a patriotic hero with a jetpack and an eye patch. This version is a hard-edged, behind-the-scenes super spy with a jetpack and an eye patch. Also, Jeremy Renner is his second-in-command, Nathan Hale. The comic version of Hale is a kid sidekick, of course, but this version is a seasoned adult espionage operative with a jetpack and a ray gun. And that is phase 1 of my imaginary hypothetical alternate cinematic universe. We'll be back next time with phase 2, because I have more ideas. Wow.